Hi there, this is Robert Andrews from CompTIacademy, and this is a video about looping in Python. Now, many students get a bit confused with this because there's more than one way of doing it, and they tend to remember parts of one way and mix it up with parts of another way. So my goal here is to clarify that, either for you as teachers or as students if you're learning how to do looping, mainly in Python, but we'll talk about it in general as well, including pseudocode. So let's start by looking at some slides, or a slide. Okay, the key point here was to give you a kind of mental map of what's going on with looping, and there's basically four types. There might be more, but I've identified four. Certainly last time I taught this, 4 ways you can do looping, and we're going to look at those. Okay, so if you can keep the distinctions between these different ways of doing it clear, then you won't get jumbled up. Now, I like these maps of topics. I use them a lot, or I used to use them a lot when I taught maths. So for example, if you were learning fractions, you've got different things for adding and subtracting versus multiplying versus dividing. And very often students jumble up all the ingredients, remember a bit of one and mix it up with another and end up getting wrong results. So I find this a really useful way of clarifying, what container each method or topic fits into, okay? So it's just a way of giving you that kind of big picture view of what's going on. So in terms of looping, let's actually break it up into 4 different types and not mix them up. So we're very clear about exactly what the rules are and the situation is for each one. So very briefly now, before I give you details in Python, loop version 1 is probably the most famous for I in range, okay? You don't have to use I, but for some counter in range, okay? You use that when well, first of all, you use for loops when you know how many times you need to iterate or loop. Okay, so that's the key distinction. If you know how many times, then you use one of the versions of the for loop. If you don't know how many times you're going to loop, but you need to base it on some condition, then that's when you use a while loop. And again, similarly with repeat until loops, which are generally used in pseudocode rather than commonly used languages, it's the same thing. You have a condition, and then you control your looping based on that condition. So that's a big distinction to make. Do you know how many iterations or loops you need to do, or repetitions? Or do you need to base it on some condition? And that's your first thing. And then you look at the details of each. Okay, so we'll come back to this slide in a moment. Okay, so I'm in idle here because it's a very popular development environment and many of you will be familiar with it. So I'm going to create a new file to save as, save it somewhere sensible. So the default place for saving stuff I don't find very helpful at all. It's like deep inside your file system. So I tend to just put files on my desktop or in some sensible location. And we're going to call this looping. Now, I don't need to add the .py because idle will do that for me. Okay. So let's look at the first version first. So version 1, for I in range, is that one, yeah? So this is a very common one. So we do this when we know how many times we're going to loop. So let's say we want to loop through, notice the use of language there, we're going to loop through a string or a list. Let's make it a string. So we'll say my string, and let's set that equal to, I don't know, what a lovely day. Okay. So there's a few things about this. First of all, you need to know how to access characters in a particular position within a string. If you can't do that, you won't be able to do any looping through a string. So what I mean by that is string, my string. If I want to access the first character, I do that. But of course, I need to print it out if I want anything to happen. Print. So if I print my string 0 and I run it, then you can see it printed W here. Okay, not a very exciting program, but it's important what's going on here. Okay, so if I want to print another one, in fact, what I'll do is I'll repeat this line, I'll copy paste it, because I think some students just don't quite get this point. So let's say I want to print the first one and then the second one. Notice the offset. I'm starting at 0, so first is 0. Okay. If I want to keep doing this, right? So this is one way to loop through a string, I suppose you could call it looping, and then print the character in that position. So let's do that. I'm not going to do the whole string, but you see we get the first few letters, right? However, it becomes tedious, and the whole point of using a computer is to avoid repetition, or one of the main points is that they're very good at repetitive tasks. So we use a loop, okay? Now, we know how many times to loop because we know in advance how many letters there are. Okay, so that's a big clue that we're going to use a for loop. So we're going to do for, and people often use I, but I'm just going to be a little bit different here and use index. Okay, why not? Because some people say it stands for index. I don't know. It might just be a useful letter, but index I think makes it a little bit clearer. For index in range. Now we do know the length of this thing, but let's say we want to make it a little bit more adaptable so that we can have different strings and still have the right number of iterations. We can do that by having the length. So len of my string. Okay. So now I've set up the iteration. And what have I done, Mr. Bracket? And I'm just going to add line numbers in case I need to refer to them. Very helpful in Python 3.8 and above. So let's just print the index. Okay, because people still get confused about what's going on even at this stage, right? If we print the index, let's have a look what happens. Okay, so this is the output from that time that we ran it. Okay, so we're just printing, the index is starting at 0, then it becomes 1, then it becomes 2, and it goes all the way until it reaches the last index in the string. Okay, and if I had a different string, so let's say, change this to something else, I don't know, hello world. Okay. This time you're going to get a different set of numbers. Okay, so you get 0 going all the way up to 11 this time. So quite a lot going on there. I'm just wondering if closing this and then reopening it will make it clearer. That's how it works. Okay, so basically you're setting index equal to 0. Now, one thing people don't always know about is if you put a 0 in there, it will behave exactly the same way, but it will be more obvious what's happening. So now we have a range going from 0 to the upper limit of the number of characters that you have. Yeah. So that's how that works. But if we want to actually print the character at that position, then we do. I don't know why I deleted print, but my string at this index, right? This index is changing each time it gets called. This index, it starts at 0, then it becomes 1. Okay, and we loop through it. So run it. Okay, and it prints hello world each time on a new line. Okay, so that's version 1. Okay, so going back to my slide, if I've still got it somewhere. Okay, so it's open in PowerPoint here, but that was for loop version 1. So for I in range, when you know how many times you need to repeat, and you need access to the index or position number, which you often do, depending on the algorithm that you're working with. So then let's go back. So that was one version. Let's keep that there. Keep the definition of the string, but we'll comment out that region because we're not. Why didn't it like that? There we go. Comment out that region. Let's do version 2. Okay. So this is where we don't need access to the index. Now this is less used in computer science, GCSE or A level, but it's used a lot in Python programming. So you would do for char or ch or whatever character in my string, okay? Then print the char. Now this is lovely, simple, elegant Python, right? So run it. And it works, okay? So you don't need to mess around with indices because you're not using the index position, okay? Whereas if you were doing something like a search algorithm and you wanted to know the position, you would need the first version because you need that index. But here you don't need the index, so you literally just loop through it. And it works the same with lists as well as strings. So that's version 2, nice and clean, very Pythonic, not used much in computer science GCSE. Although you'd probably get away with it in the exam, it's good to stick to code that looks a bit like pseudocode in the exam because that's kind of the basis for their marking schemes. So we'll get rid of that one. So comment out that region. Okay, so then we want a while loop. Okay, now while loops can be really confusing, and what I've seen again and again is that students will mix up components of this way of doing things with the for loops and everything just falls apart. So let's just bring up the slide for this one. So in a while loop, you use it when you don't know how many times you need to iterate. So it's probably not the best choice for iterating through a string or a list, but let's say for some reason you want to. So we use a condition to decide whether or not to continue looping. And we have to manually control the count. So what does that mean? So first of all, we have to have a counter. So we do count equals 0, right? And then we create a while loop. While counter is less than the length of my string, right? I'm going to print my string at the position of my counter. Okay. Now that looks like it might work, but there's a problem. Let's run it and see. Okay, so you can see I'm just getting an infinite loop and it's printing the first character. So why would that be? Well, again, this comes up a lot. We haven't actually given the while loop a reason to stop, okay? Because we've said that as long as counter is less than the length of my string, and the length of my string is 10 or something, right? And it's 0, we're not changing it. So that's what I mean by manually controlling the count. You have to do counter equals counter plus 1. Then you have the possibility of moving towards this condition at each iteration, each time through the loop. So you will eventually exit. If you don't do that, infinite loop land. All right, so let's run that. Hello world, okay, so that works. Now again and again, students will take little bits of this. I need to increase something. They'll do that inside the for loop. They don't need to, because for loop automatically increments your counter. Whereas with a while loop, you have to do it manually. Okay, so keep those distinctions clear. Coming back to our slide here. Okay, keep, which one are you in? Are you doing this one, you're doing while loops, you're doing repeat until. Repeat until you probably wouldn't ever do in Python, but there is a kind of a way around it, which I'm going to show you. We're going to uncomment all that. Sorry, not uncomment, I meant comment out of that region. So we're going to do repeat until, okay? So we're going to do the same thing with our counter. Counter equals 0, and then we're going to do while true. Now, some teachers will probably faint when they see this, but as far as I'm concerned, it's the most direct translation of the idiom, and it's crazy not to do it this way. Otherwise, you just add another layer of complexity, but that's just my personal opinion. So while true, we're going to print. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our check at the end, okay? So we're going to do if counter is greater than len. And you might actually have, if we do it like this, we're going to be recalculating the length every time, but don't worry. You might have just done that before and used a variable here, but len of my string, all right? Then we're going to break. Now, I'm not sure if I might get off by 1 error. It's quite possible, but let's have a look. Well, what have I done? Yes, I've fallen into the same trap. So it's like a while thing, okay? So we can increase here after printing it, counter equals counter plus 1. And I can't resist showing you that, you know, if you're programming often, you're actually going to do counter plus equals 1 to mean the same thing. But in terms of GCSE computer science, you should probably do counter equals counter plus 1. Let's see if that fixes it. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I've actually gone 1 too far. So maybe less than or equal, greater than or equal to. Let's try that. You very often get off by 1 errors. It's a common thing to happen. There you go. So there it is. Okay, so the main point here is just don't be confused about the different ways of doing it. Know how to do them all, and not only that, know when it's appropriate to do one or the other of them. Yeah. So let's come back to our slides just to talk about that one more time. Maybe drive it home. If you know how many times you're going to iterate, then use a for loop, right? If you need the index, use version 1 for I in range. If you know how many times you can iterate, but you don't need access to the index, use for item in string. And obviously item can be replaced with any word as long as you then use that word in the body of your loop. If you don't know how many times you're going to repeat, or if for some reason you want to use a while loop anyway, then go ahead, but realize that it's based on a condition and you have to manually control the count in order for that condition to be approached so you can exit the loop. And then if you're doing pseudocode and you need for some reason to translate it into program code in Python particularly, the construct while true do stuff if some condition holds break is exactly parallel to the syntax of the repeat until loop. So that's my recommended way of translating that. Okay, so there it is. I hope that was helpful. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.